about what it means to wait, what it means to take Sabbath and pause. I hope you all take moments in your work to stop in silence and to listen to the bones that are around you. And also the well-being of others. I hope this skeleton causes us to be humble enough to ask questions of social justice in our streets, of asking deep questions of what it means to be servants. And also I hope that you can be made and unmade by this whale that you have now been a part of so richly. So I'll pause there and I'll turn it back over to Dr. Moe.
Hey, thanks so much, Dr. Keuss. That was wonderful. That was really exciting, and I love those pictures at the end of our whale. That was fantastic. So our next speaker is Dr. Gaile Moe. So we're going to go from theology into nutrition for a totally different perspective on the Leviathan. So, Dr. Moe.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I too am going to hopefully open this up. Okay, good. All right, let me go back one. All right, so I, by trade, am a nutritionist, by trade and by training. Really, I don't, true confession, don't know a ton about whales and their biology and physiology. I've lived my whole life in the Northwest, much of it pretty close to the Sound, and I've always felt pretty connected to whales, sort of as kind of canary species, if you will, that tell us a lot about what's going on in our environment. So when Peter, Dr. Moe, and he and I are not related, but we share a last name. Anyhow, when he told me about this, I said, oh, maybe I can talk about lactation. Whales are mammals, and all mammals feed their young for some period of time, some for years, and others just for a few days, but they all lactate. And I thought it would be really interesting to look at sort of that process in whales, and you maybe use as a comparison humans. So here we go with that. You might be aware that lactation is really, it's one of the most energetically expensive physiologic processes that we have. And it's hard to study in whales because they're often under the water. You can't really express milk from a whale to understand how the composition varies from month to month, or even from the beginning of a feeding to the end of a feeding. We know a lot about human nutrition and lactation, but we don't know much about whales, and indeed a lot of other mammals. So this is just a picture of a humpback whale and its calf. And you can sort of see, I just chose it, the citations at the end of my slides. You can sort of see that there's a slit there. And so instead of having breasts, the calves have to actually access the milk through that slit right there. And it's fascinating to me that whale calves actually pretty much exclusively feed for about 7 to 8 months with milk. And then after that time, they go on to feed in the way that whales normally do. And a lot of that time, I'm not sure what you've studied about gray whales, but their migration from where they're born in Mexico, and then they migrate up to their feeding grounds in Alaska and the Arctic. So much of that migration, they're feeding like this until they get up to those feeding grounds. So a little bit more too about, it's a big stress on the mother, and we'll look at that in a minute. So to begin with, this is lots of numbers up here, but this is a comparison of human milk to cow's milk. I figured most people are familiar with that, to whale milk, and then lastly to heavy cream. So what I want you to see here is that, let's just look at, you know, human milk versus whale milk. They're really different from one another. You can see that human milk is only about 4%, 4 to 5% fat, whereas whale milk is anywhere from 35 to, I kept running across 53 in the literature that I looked at. So I threw that number in there as well. 53% fat, so really high fat. Similarly, it's got a high protein content as well. But notice the carbohydrate content. So in human milk, you can see we've got 7 grams per 100 grams. Some of that is lactose, some of it are these other really special carbohydrates that are called oligosaccharides, that are really important for helping the gut mature and so on. But whale milk, there's only 1 to 2% carbohydrate. And you know, this is I think the most fascinating thing that I learned is that probably the reason why it's so low is that when the mother and the calf pair start their journey from Baja up to Alaska, the mother is fasting. So when she comes to Mexico to give birth, and then the time they're in the lagoons there, and then when they travel up to the Arctic, fasting almost the whole time. And so this low carbohydrate content in her milk means that she doesn't have to have as much gluconeogenesis going on. We all need a little glucose in our blood, right? It fuels your brain, it fuels your nervous system, and if you don't have it, you run into trouble. So because she doesn't have a source of glucose coming in, and she's just relying on her own body to make glucose, which is energetically expensive, it's not an easy metabolic pathway, then she keeps the carbohydrate in the breast milk low, and that helps her to survive and be able to make that trip with her baby up to Alaska. Okay, and then you can also compare the whale milk to human milk and look at the energy content. So I've got calories per 100 grams there. Really how nutritionists think of this is calories per ounce. And, you know, we say breast milk is about 20 calories per ounce, as is most infant formula, you know, that stuff that you mix up and pour into a bottle and feed a baby. That's also about 20 calories per ounce. Whale milk, on the other hand, is somewhere between 110 and 138 calories per ounce. So it's really, really super rich. And, you know, for comparison there, I've got heavy cream, which you're probably familiar with. If you go to the grocery store, you can look for, comes in these little cartons, heavy whipping cream. And that is, you can see, about 36% fat. That's why it tastes so good. And it's got about 340 calories per 100 grams, okay? So that sort of gives you a sense there of how to compare them. All right, then some other comparisons here are, we can just sort of put this milk into context, is, and maybe I should have started with this. I wasn't really quite sure what would be the best way to do this, but you can compare gestation. Whales, it's about 12 to 13 months. Humans, we're looking at, we always say 9 months, but really the way doctors look at it, and anybody who cares for pregnant women, it's 38 to 42 weeks, counting from the first day of the last menstrual period. The weight stuff is probably not that interesting as a comparison, but human babies are typically 6 to 9 pounds. Sorry, 2.7 to 4.1 kilograms, and just by way of reference, there are 2.2 pounds per kilogram. And then whale babies are, they're enormous, right? Gray whale babies, 500 to 900 kilograms. And they never have more than one baby at a time. Whereas humans, as you know, can have 2, 3, 4 in one pregnancy. So also, whales tend to have babies every other year. And what can happen, though, is if the food supply gets really low, because if you're a whale, and particularly a female, the females are bigger than the males, you have to get a lot of fat on board, a lot of blubber to support that pregnancy and to support lactation, because remember, you're fasting, and this is an energetically expensive process. So it is all the fat that a female has that supports that process of lactation. And so this, when you think about the amount of food that whales need, I tried to find good estimates of, what their energy requirements might be. And there's various, first of all, it's not easy to calculate. But one calculation was about, for a female adult, would be over 800,000 calories a day. So, from their bottom feeding that they do. And then for a younger whale, it might be like 750,000 calories a day. And that, of course, is coming from milk for that first to 7 to 8 months. And so those babies are consuming, 50, 60, 70 gallons of milk every day to meet their energy requirements, which allows them to swim to the north and also start to put on blubber, because they have to do that in order to survive. So then if you want to, look at how much they ultimately weigh, so here, this is US, our average adult weight is 177.5 pounds. And that's all heights, men, women. And then for whales, we're talking about 30 to 40 tons for these gray whales. If they're well nourished, if there's plenty of food around, that's what they'll ultimately weigh. And then in terms of, nutritionists always look at, as do physicians, look at growth as one way of measuring health in infants. Babies that are growing well and hitting their developmental milestones, you feel pretty good about in terms of their overall health. And so normally a baby would pretty close to triple their birth weight in their first year. So if they are, 8 pounds when they're born, that means 24 pounds at the age of 1. Whales, on the other hand, incur a 7 to 8-fold increase in weight during that period of lactation. So it's even shorter than that first year. In terms of energy requirements, the way nutritionists look at it is calories per kilogram. And And so sort of the standard that's used is in the first year, there's a range 85 to 108 calories per kilogram, which is the highest that it is in your lifetime. As adults, we need nowhere close to that. And it's higher the closer you are to being born. So it's less when you're a year old than it is at 2 months. For whales, I did quite a bit of calculating, looking at different estimates of energy. Read a really interesting paper about a gray whale that was rehabilitated at SeaWorld, and they kept wonderful data on that whale's energy intake and its growth. And they were feeding around 60 to 65 calories per kilogram, but remarkably, that dropped all the way to 20 when that whale was getting ready to be released and was able to feed itself by bottom feeding. And then comparing again, whales lactate for about 7 to 9 months. Humans, this varies tremendously from culture to culture and person to person within culture. Just, put on my nutritionist hat here. The CDC and the World Health Organization both recommend that women should exclusively breastfeed through age 6 months. And then after 6 months, keep breastfeeding, but start introducing other foods. Washington State, by the way, has one of the highest rates of breastfeeding in the country. So public health officials have done a good job here with that. In terms of diet, the maternal diet during lactation, if you're a woman and you're breastfeeding, you just can eat. Your baby might be intolerant to certain things, but really there's not any special diet. Whales, as I said before, are mainly fasting, and so they can lose up to 1/3 of their body weight to provide the energy that's needed for milk production. And then does that happen with humans? Again, that just depends hugely on diet. A lot of women actually gain weight when they're breastfeeding, eating more calories really than what they need. So I think I'm sure you've heard about, the whale that you're working with, Peter got off a beach and it was probably all bloated is she a she? Was it a female? Yep, okay. So there have been many instances reported of female whales being beached in Oregon and Washington. And really the thinking is that by some people is that this is a lack of adequate food for the whales maybe due to climate change, in part, changing the what's going on the bottom of the ocean, so there's not enough food to sustain them. The other thing that's being noted is that birth intervals are spreading out. And so instead of every other year, it's more like every 3rd year, every 4th year, so that the whales can have enough fat storage to sustain a pregnancy and to sustain lactation and rearing of the young. So, I think that as Dr. Keuss left you with a question, I think another question we could think through is how climate change and what we as humans are doing is impacting other species on Earth. And it seems, and how is it impacting whales? We know our orca populations have gone way down due to lack of food. So that's the question I would like to leave you with. And now we'll turn it over to Dr. Willett.
Thanks, Dr. Moe. I remember when I was a kid growing up, my mom would say that between me and my two brothers, we would go through a gallon of milk a day. And I thought that was impressive. And then you said these whales are drinking 70 gallons of milk a day.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, so I'm going to turn it over here to Dr. Willett now, and he's going to give us the perspective of a poet. So Dr. Willett, what do you have?
Stop my share. There we go.
I don't have any screen to share with you guys. I'm just going to say words at you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm going to do it quickly because there's a lot of ground to cover. Obviously, thank you, Gail and Jeff, for those presentations, and Peter for having me. This is really cool. Students, I am so jealous of you. I just want you to know that. I can't believe you get to be in this class and that I don't, except for this little evening. It's such a sweet thing. I want to try to say some things about how whales can help us think about poetry and how poetry might help us think about whales. And to do that, I have to share some verse with you. Didn't have the foresight to send it to you ahead of time. That would have been a good pedagogical move. So I'm going to read it to you instead. I would put it up on the screen, but I want you to try to hear this even though we have a computer involved. The first point that I want to make, though, is that literary history is evolutionary. One thing happens, and if it's hard, and if it works, if it's useful, something else will bind up next to it, and then something else, and then something else. Yeah, in this kind of chain that eventually becomes something like a spine. I'll say, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. I'm going to say some things about poems that won't seem like I'm talking about whales until at the end when it suddenly does. Okay, that's my outline. In 701 BC, here's a bit of history. 701 BC, the Assyrians attacked Judah and the surrounding tribes and Jerusalem, okay? Generally figured to be bad guys. The Assyrians were kind of hotshots. They're the people who hunted lions for fun, for sport. So they're like super tough. They don't like the Hebrew God. And they come in to decimate the Hebrew population. They have a fine time with the hill towns, but they get to Jerusalem and they don't have so good a time. This is a historical thing that happened. It's like real. It's in the Assyrian history books. It's also in the book of 2nd Chronicles and the book of 2nd Kings, for those of you who know your Bible well. And that's the first bit of poetry that I want to share with you from 2nd Kings chapter 8. Here's the Hebrew story of what happened there. Jehovah said to Hezekiah, I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. And then the following night, the angel of the Lord smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. So by morning, most of the Assyrian army was found as dead corpses. Okay, that's a way of saying the Israelites won. When the Assyrians say it, they just said, boy, those Hebrews gave us a hard time. But that's their version of it. Instead, the angel of the Lord came and smote. So we don't know what happened, except that according to the Hebrew records, 100,000 of them ended up dead, and they went back skittering to their houses. Okay, that's sort of brick one or piece one, whatever you want to call it. Much later on, in 1815, there's a poet called George Gordon Lord Byron. I hope some of you have heard of him. He was the most famous poet that there ever was. That's probably fair to say. Maybe ever has been, even since. Combining political wit, rakish good looks, obscene wealth. He was a war hero for a while. There's statues of him in Greece, and then he's also the best poet of his generation, at least according to him anyways. So he's firing on all cylinders, yeah? 1815, he wants to make a whole book about the Hebrews. And he writes this poem, among some others. This one's called The Destruction of Sennacherib. Okay, and this takes the same instance, and he's just trying to narrate it. I'm just gonna read the first two cantos here. The Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold. And the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, when the deep blue wave rolls nightly on Galilee. That's just the first one, but I love all the things that are happening in it. First of all, this presumption of innocence on the part of the Hebrews, and they come in like a wolf to destroy him. Now remember, the Hebrews won. They killed 100,000, or somebody killed 100,000 Assyrians. But the way he narrates it is, well, we were just hanging out like sheep, and these Assyrians came down just to tear our flesh apart. And then their cohorts gleam in purple and gold because those are this worldly colors. They're kingly colors for the monarchy of this world, not of God's kingdom, right? So like Professor Keuss was saying, like you don't want to be part of the ruling of this world. You want to have your kingdomship elsewhere, your citizenship elsewhere. Byron is calling out that difference. These people wearing purple and gold, they're acting like they're the kings of the world, and they're not. God is. And the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea. I love, picture how calm the scene is, right? We've got a lamb, there's stars, there's a sea, a wave gently rolling, and then Galilee, which you're supposed to think about baby Jesus and Christmas and all that, right? So it's like, it's infancy, it's preciousness, it's all this tenderness, right? And this wolf comes in to sort of smash everything apart. That's the scene that he sets through those kinds of metaphors. Here's the next stanza of that one. Like the leaves of the forest when summer is green, that host with their banners at sunset was seen. Like the leaves of the forest when autumn hath blown, that host on the morrow lay withered and strown. And I like what he does there first in comparing, like, they were a force of nature. That's a phrase we still use. There were so many of them, it seemed like they were basically leaves on trees, like in summertime, just thick and you can't keep it back. But then he returns to the same start of the metaphor, which I think is really beautiful. He says, look, I know they were like the leaves of the forest, but were they more like the summer leaves of the forest or the winter leaves of the forest? Because then they got all crumpled and dead. You see what I mean? He says, now what were they like? They were like leaves for sure, but what does that mean? What does that tell us about Assyrians? Okay, that's the destruction of Sennacherib from Lord Byron. All I plan to do with that for just the moment. And now I'm going to share with you a third bit of poetry. This one is by a poet. I should say the destruction of Sennacherib is important because every British school child had to memorize it for something like 100 years. It's one of those texts that you have to recite well because it's kind of difficult, but it kind of sings songs and there's animals in it. So they made you memorize it and speak it, and you get beat on the knuckles if you get a word wrong, you know, British schooling. So that's important to keep in mind because it's a cultural touchstone, like everybody knows it for a century. But that also means, as some of you probably recognize, not from this class, of course, but when someone assigns you something, you kind of hate it. Do you know what I mean? Like, even if it's good, it's like, yeah, but it's for an assignment. Not for this class, but you know what I'm saying? Like, there's this little rebellion we get when someone tells us to do something, like you and your mom and your uncle, everyone memorized this poem. So some people didn't like it, including Ogden Nash, who grew up in a British school. Here's his poem. It's a bit long, but you're in college, you can hang out, okay. Oh, this is a funny poem. Some poems are like serious and, you know, sonorous and profound, but you're allowed to laugh. I can't hear you because you're muted, but you can do it. One thing that literature would be greatly the better for would be a more restricted employment by the authors of simile and metaphor. Authors of all races, be they Greeks, Romans, Teutons, or Celts, can't seem to just say the thing is the thing it is, but have to go out of their way to say that it is like something else. What does it mean when we are told that the Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold? In the first place, George Gordon Byron had enough experience to know that it probably wasn't just one Assyrian, it was probably a lot of Assyrians. However, as too many arguments are apt to endose apoplexy and thus hinder longevity, we'll let it pass as one Assyrian for the sake of brevity. Now then, this particular Assyrian, the one whose cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, just what does the poet mean when he says that they came down like a wolf on the fold? In heaven and earth, more than is dreamed of in our philosophy, there are a great many things, but I don't imagine that among them there is a wolf with purple and gold cohorts or purple and gold anythings. No, no, Lord Byron, before I'll believe that this Assyrian was actually like a wolf, I must have some kind of proof. How do we get knowledge? Where does proof come from? That's not part of the poem. Did he run around on all fours? What was its function? How did you know? What did it do with its flippers? Did it run around on all fours? Did he have a big hairy tail and a big red mouth and big teeth? And did he say woof, woof? Frankly, I think it most unlikely. And all that you were entitled to say at the very most was that the Assyrian cohorts came down like a lot of Assyrian cohorts about to destroy the Hebrew host. But that wasn't fancy enough for Lord Byron. Oh dear me, no. He had to invent lots of figures of speech and then interpolate them, with the result that whenever you mention Old Testament soldiers to people, they say, oh yes, they're the ones that had a lot of wolves dressed up with purple and gold and they ate them. That's the kind of thing that's always being done by poets, from Homer to Tennyson. They're always comparing ladies to lilies and veal to venison. And they always say things like that snow was a white blanket after the winter storm. Oh, it is, all right. All right, then. You sleep under a 6-inch blanket of snow, and I'll sleep under a 1/2-inch blanket of unpoetical blanket material, and we'll see which one of us keeps warm. And after that, maybe you will begin to comprehend dimly what I mean by too much metaphor and simile. Okay, that's Ogden Nash trying to get at his teachers, right? Trying to get at the canon, trying to get at all the Assyrian generals he had to memorize, all the poems that his teacher, and all the times they smacked his knuckles, right? He's trying to take the piss out of this thing that's a cultural touchstone, that's huge. He's trying to kill something that's large and incomprehensible to him. Do you see that? He's kind of pull the rug out from under the thing. Okay. Now, this is about a lot of things. That poem right there that I just read by Ogden Nash is about a lot of things. One of them is about how metaphors work, how they do their stuff, right? The idea about metaphors is it's supposed to teach you something you didn't know about the thing you were talking about. So if you say something, take like a cliched example, like my love is like a rose. Think, oh yeah, sure, I've heard that, but what is that? Why do we say that? It totally isn't. Your love is nothing like a rose, except, well, then you have to, like, why do we use these words, as Dr. Moe was saying? And you think, well, I mean, the black-eyed Susans are blooming, and there's thousands of them, but the roses have like only 2 on the whole bush. So maybe it's rare. Love is rare. Okay. That starts to get you somewhere. You see what I mean? You smell roses, and you're not like, oh, that's enough of that. You kind of keep smelling them, My daughter did it last week, and she got pollen on her nose, and it was really cute because it stayed there for a weirdly long time. But think about it. Oh, okay. So love is something that you don't get enough of, that right intoxicates you when you want more. Do you see what I mean? So metaphor is there to not be like to be fancy. It's to teach you something that you didn't know before about the thing you thought you knew. Okay. Note here all the stuff that so far that one poem has dredged up for us from the deep. Yeah. We have the work of metaphors, Assyrians, which probably you guys hadn't thought of for a long time, but they're super interesting historical things. The nature of British schooling, George Gordon, Lord Byron, yeah? And then this question of what does poetry actually do? The only thing that it seems to me it's not about is whales, except that it is. The poem is called Very Like a Whale. That's the name of this poem if you want to look it up for yourself. It's called Very Like a Whale. And that line, to click another brick in the sort of evolutionary, or another, whatever, I don't know what your bones are called, chevron, another piece of the thing, another piece of the spine, right, that then branches out into these 100 areas of concern, like ribs. From the Book of Kings, the Book of Chronicles, the Assyrian tablets, then we get to Lord Byron, then we get to Ogden Nash. Just those 4 words, very like a whale, call up another bit of literary history, and it's from Hamlet. Those of you that were forced in your own schooling to read Hamlet may recognize the scene when Polonius is there and he's trying to buddy up to Hamlet to find out what's wrong with him, yeah? And Hamlet starts looking at the clouds because he's acting like a weirdo, those of you who know the poem, the play. And he says, look at those clouds, they looks just like a duck. And Polonius is like, yeah, man, totally a duck. And then he goes, he thinks it's more like a weasel. And then Polonius says, yeah, come to think of it, that is kind of like a weasel. And then he says, more like a whale. And Polonius says, very like a whale. And that's where this tagline comes from. So that's another instance where Hamlet is trying to slay his literary forebearer, right? Polonius is the person with wealth and power and blah, blah, blah. Hamlet's a punk kid with a lot on his mind right now, and he's trying to like pull the rug out from under him. And the way he does it, the way he slays this great and indistinct kind of thing, is by teasing him essentially. But in this case, he does it through linguistic coercion. He says, hey, do you see what I see? And Polonius' sense of belonging is triggered, right? He goes, yeah, I see that. But I don't think that's all there is to it, actually. I think usually it's read as, oh, he's making fun of Polonius, okay. But I actually think that we can all recognize that. Like, think through your own experience. Whenever you've seen a wave or a mountain or a cloud, right? And you say, hey, that looks like a battleship. And you're like, I don't see it. Oh, no, it does look like a battleship, right? And it truly does. You're not just saying that usually. You're not just saying that to make your friend like feel better or something like that, yeah? There's something about language that makes us want to come on board with it, yeah? I see that thing. And if I use like, first it was just a bunch of clouds, and then someone put a name to it, and now it means something, right? Because it connects to something that recognizes that I have a category for. Oh yeah, it is like a whale, that whale-shaped cloud. And then you can get everyone else to see it, yeah? The only, how do I say this? Poetry is taking something. Basically, what poetry is, you take something that's a feeling, a thought, a connection between two things that no one else has seen, yeah, and making it visible for them. Taking something that was big and mysterious and scary and unknown and dark and under the surface of the water and raising it up to a place where people can see it. Let me suggest that that's mainly the work of literature, mainly the work of those metaphors that Ogden Nash has such fun sort of kicking around, is to take something that no one has seen. Because we have that, right? When you're on the ferry and if you see a whale, no one just goes, a whale. Like you point to other people, oh my gosh, I saw one. And then they all come over. Why do you do that, right? There's no scarcity principle. It's not going to go away more because more people are seeing it. But it's almost as if seeing a whale is a corporate experience. Do you know what I mean? It's like it didn't happen if no one else saw it. Because it's not that fun to say, I saw a whale and no one else did. You're like, yeah, sure you did. How big was it? Big. You know what I mean? You can't give the experience to anyone. So you invite them into it. Using language, you get them alongside and you put their vision next to your vision and say, can you see what I see in here? You see that thing? That's what I mean by linguistic coercion, in the sense that there's kind of a sociology implied to it. And in that, poetry, let me say, as whales also, is kind of a figure of the imagination itself. Yeah, these nebulous, you know, dreams are kind of just a bunch of colors and shapes, and mine are anyways. And you don't know, nobody knows what they are. They're nothing until you make something out of it, until it becomes something in language, until, is that what this class is actually officially called? Until you articulate it. Yeah. Okay, that's all for me.
Oh goodness, Mischa, that was so much fun. Thanks so much. And I love what you did with articulation at the end there. That's
I thought that was the coolest name for a class I'd seen. Like, what a thoughtful thing. So
yeah, I mean, that is the technical term. When you take a bunch of bones, you put it together, you articulate them. Yeah, it works so well.
Oh, I thought you were being fancy with that. Okay, that's actually what it's called. Great.
That's what it's called. Well, hey, I'd like to give us, I know we went a little bit over, but I still want to give the panelists some time to answer a couple questions. So maybe we'll just take 10 minutes here for a little Q&A before we call it a night. Do any of the students or any of the people from the public participants have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists?
I guess I maybe have something, both for Dr. Willett and Dr. Keuss. You both kind of talked about knowing being a kind of articulation of using language to know things, but I wonder what maybe both of you have to say about things like feelings that we can't always put language to, and maybe like the limits of language in particular as a mode of knowing.
Okay, you want to go first on that as the poet?
So that's the set move, right? She bumped it, you said it, and then, yeah, actually, that's a very, very large discussion from me, so I won't inflict it all. My dissertation is called The Drive to Linguistic Failure. So it's about this moment when you get language to fail at describing something. And what I talk about in that book is how poets sometimes cheat, because when you want to describe something that's incomprehensible, that's too big, right? That's too big for your mind. We're not talking like a whale or something like that, but it's a concept like God. Well, let's call God the this symbol. Let's never say his name, right? What they do is create an absence. They create some kind of stutter so that you don't wrap language around it. Yeah. So they kind of make their own walled city, their own sort of fence. And we know what this is, right? You've been to a concert or had a snow cone, or I don't know what people are into, but you have some experience that's really incredible, and you say, it was just amazing. It was like, wah. Now what's that? Wah is nothing. Nobody can write that down. Like, what did you just communicate? On the one hand, you communicated nothing. That won't hold up in court. The court reporter types, it was like, wah, right? But on the other hand, you have communicated something, and that's the trigger in your mind of your own linguistic failure. You said, in effect, this thing is so great, I can't describe it. And that's what we do whenever we make some sort of a nonsense expletive like that, or lose our train of thought. It was just like, oh my gosh. Oh, my daughter says that. She's only 7. And she says, quote, it was just like, oh my gosh. Like, that's not a sentence. You've observed nothing, except it kind of is, right? She's pointed to, it was, I'm trying for a metaphor. I can't find it. I have failed. You see what I mean? So, and that ends up hedging the thing into its proper space, the space of the mysterious and unsayable.
Yeah, I think I would just add, yeah, great question. I think, again, back to Leviathan and back to the whale that you are caring for through your class is, in the Hebrew, the word to know is da'ah. In Greek, it's gnosis. But da'ah is a type of knowing that is so intimate and personal that can only be done in relationship. So language is the bridge by which relationships become possible. But once relationships happen, then language pulls back and intimacy occurs. And so to know the whale that you are now a part of, there's parts of your experience with these bones and these vertebrae that will never have language attached to them. You can point to them, you can use different symbols to get there, but there are aspects that'll be like blips and clicks. When Professor Stegora talked about negative space, there'll be places you won't be able to describe on these 3 weeks you've been working on this whale. And that's a good thing, because that actually is what knowing is getting to the place where language begins to recede and intimacy begins. So all knowing for the Hebrews was relational. It never was individualistic. So I think maybe that's part of it too. And I say one more thing about words, and which gets to, I think, what Dr. Willett was talking about as well, is that they are placeholders for something beyond themselves. What you're building in Eaton Hall is an icon, something to look through and see beyond it, not just to it. And so language always does that too. It creates a space and a framing by which we look through it, not just at it. And I hope you are doing that as well.
You know, if I could jump in, I think Gaile's presentation is working off metaphor as well. Because I know what heavy whipping cream is, and I know what whole milk is, and I know what like breast milk is, right? But I have no understanding at all of what whale milk is. And so to just say that like, oh, whales drink a lot of milk, or it's really rich, like I have no frame of reference. But then when she puts that chart up there of like whole milk has this many grams of fat, whale milk has this much, or, you know, this many calories and whale milk has this, then you get that comparison thing going. You know, and Aristotle says the way that metaphor teaches is that you take an object that you understand and one that you don't, you pair them together, kind of like what Mischa was saying. And that's where the learning happens. So, I mean, I feel like that chart that Gaile made was like a form of metaphor, just in that act of comparing like whole milk, heavy cream, and whale milk.
And I guess I could add to the original question. I don't really know the answer to that, of course, but one might also look to the animal kingdom and to all the species that don't have language yet manage to show their feelings throughout their lives, care for one another, care for their young, sorrow. I think there's probably a lot to be learned outside of our own experience.
Yeah, thanks, Gaile.
Yeah.
I think we got time for one more question. Somebody want to close us out for tonight?
I have a question for Dr. Moe about the like lactation and stuff. So with the story that was going around last year of like the whale mother who lost her calf, how did the fact that like she didn't she wasn't actually lactating, like how would that affect her like physiologically, if that
Yeah,
makes sense?
so I assume that, so basically what happens is during pregnancy, you have, you basically have alveoli that, and I'm assuming whales have some sort of similar physiology, that have secretory cells that produce the milk, right? And so that all gets primed during pregnancy. And then after a baby or a whale calf is born, there's different hormones that cause the milk production to increase as you feed. So you might think about like when a baby is just born, a calf or a human, they don't take in nearly as much as they do when they're 6 months old, right? Because they're bigger and they're more active and all those things. And so what happens is that your body just responds to the stimulus of needing to produce more milk, and it does produce more milk. And so this whale that lost her calf, it probably took her a couple weeks, but her cells would stop producing milk, and eventually that whole process would just stop. It's just sort of like an abrupt weaning, if you will, as opposed to a more gradual thing, which is, you know, what whales do. They don't go from just I can't say breastfeeding, but just feeding milk to being able to eat off the ocean floor. It's a gradual process. They have to learn how to feed themselves and so on and so forth. And the milk production just slows down.
Good question, Emily.
Amazing, actually, I think, that there's all these different species, and you know, they different species have different proportions of nutrients. I read one article, I don't know if I could find my notes on it, but I thought I can't go into this in 10 minutes, but where you know, different animals like black rhinos only have 0.2% fat in their milk. And nobody really quite understands why that is. And wallabies have this incredibly high carbohydrate content in their milk. And cottontail rabbits have super high protein content. So, you know, part of the thinking is, well, anyhow, there's not really super great answers to why there's all this variability yet. Probably related to growth rates and how long babies actually get milk from their mothers and that kind of thing. But it's a really, if there's any biologists out there, it's a really ripe area to study, I would think, in graduate school. Super interesting.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for coming tonight. We're all out of time. Jeff just sent me his slides, so I'm going to post those on Canvas so the students can reference them. I'll also post mine. Gail, if you have a moment, could you send me your slides?
I will, and I'm really sorry I didn't show you my sources, but they're there, so you can look at them.
And then Mischa, could you send like a list of the poems perhaps, or maybe just put the poems on like a single Word doc and send that over? I'd like to be able to post those all for the students. Thanks so much, everybody. So we have our last lecture is next week, and that's when we have Dr. Long talking about ecology. And then we have somebody from the Seattle Times, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, and Cascadia Research. So that's going to be awesome. We'll see you all tomorrow with the whale, and I hope you all have a good night.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.